Good morning, everyone. We are in Perek Chavchet, chapter 28 in Sefer Yeshayahu. In this Perek, we're taking a bit of a different turn from what we've had in the past several prakim. Past several prakim have talked about end of days visions. Now we're talking most likely about the period of time during Chizkiyahu HaMelech, when Sancheriv was attacking the north, had destroyed the north, had exiled the north, and was now going against the south. And while there are some Meforshim who also take this as an end of days prophecy, if you look at it, it really works very well as being a contemporary prophecy of what will be going on at that time. In terms of the prophecy itself, we need to remember a couple of things. One is Yeshayahu was a Navi in the southern kingdom, in Malchut Yehudah, not in Malchut Yisrael. Nevertheless, this Perek is going to start out with a conversation or a series of warnings that he's making against the north. And so there's some questions of how that is possible to have happened. One of the possibilities is very simply that part of his job was to warn the Malchut Yehudah about possibly falling into the same trap as the north had been. And so while he didn't travel to the north as far as we know, nevertheless, it seems to be that it would have been appropriate for him to also be talking about what's going on, just as we would say, look what's happening over there. You don't want it to happen over here. It's not that kind of language that he's using, though, which creates that bit of a problem. It seems to be a direct chastisement to the north, as opposed to, we see a little bit later in the Perek, where he switches over and talks about the south. In terms of the division of the Perek, it's a simple way of saying there's 6 parts to this Perek that we're going to get into. The first part is a tochacha, is this chastisement, this warning, l'shikurei Ephraim, to the drunkards of the northern kingdom of Ephraim. That's going to be the first 4 psukim. A person who is drunk, even in English, we use this terminology, that you could be drunk with power. It's a person not necessarily just talking about an alcoholic, but it's a person who's so full of themselves. Then he's going to be talking about what's going to happen to those people who will survive that onslaught of the north, and it'll be a positive kind of promise to them. Then he's going to turn to the south. And to the south, he's going to be turning to chastising the Kohanim and Leviim, who are also, in his mind, considered Shikurim, who are copying what's going on in the north. And now, again, that's a little bit problematic, because at the time of Chizkiyahu HaMelech, at the time when this was supposedly taking place, or assumedly taking place, we really don't have clear indications that Kohanim and Levim were perverting justice as we do find in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. We don't see it the same way. And Nevi'im makes it even more complicated, because if Nevi'im are off, then there shouldn't be Nevi'im. Whereas a person gets nevuah, he gets prophecy because he rises to a certain spiritual level. And how do you have a person who is going to be described as a drunkard being a Navi? And so some suggest it might be a Navi Sheker, some suggest other possibilities, former Nevi'im. One other possibility, which we'll see in the Targum Yonatan, is going to say it's not a Navi at all. When we talk about a Navi, the Targum Yonatan takes the approach that it's Sofrim, that they're the scribes of the people as opposed to the Nevi'im, which it has basis for it as well. Then comes the next part, which is even more complicated, from Pasuk Tet to Yud Gimel, where people are going to be scoffing. People are going to be making fun of the Navi, of Yeshayahu, and he's going to be addressing them. Then come to the people who feel really confident, Pasuk Yudalet to Pasuk Chafbet, people who feel very, very confident in all of the tactics they've used to be protected. Now, if you remember, at the time of Sancheriv's onslaught and to the south, one of the things that the Malchut Yehudah did, and the mistakes they made, was they created alliances with Mitzrayim, figuring that Mitzrayim, the other major power of the world, would save them from Ashur that was up in the north. That ultimately was a mistake. Whenever we rely on those foreign powers, we see it in modern times as well. Relying on foreign powers is something that is temporary, but at the end of the day, everyone has, and this is, I learned many, many years ago in political science, whenever you have a treaty between nations is not worth the paper it's written on. It's only a treaty as long as it serves the purposes of both nations. Once it no longer serves the purpose of one nation, that treaty is broken. And the same thing we find in the time of Yeshayahu, and the same thing we find in the time of the of Malchut Yehuda as well. When they turn to someone else as opposed to relying on themselves, relying on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then they have the problem along the way. And then finally, we end with a very interesting set of mishalim. Now, the parables that are going to be offered, it's viewed in either two parables or one parable with two parts. We'll see it at the end, and hopefully we'll make it through the whole parak today. That's the background on the parak itself. Let's get started. Pasuk begins, Hoy. Now, the word hoy is always like, in English, would be translated to oi. Okay, hoy is like a sorrowful kind of cry. Ateret geut shikurei Ephraim. So the crown of haughtiness, ga'ava, is geut, to those who are drunken in Ephraim. Now, at this point, what the Navi is saying is that the people of Ephraim, the people of the north, are really creating for themselves this false perception that they're so important. And so they're crowning themselves. The Ateret also identifies, obviously, if someone wearing a crown would be the people who are in charge. Okay, so it could be both the general public, but definitely the leadership. They're crowning themselves with a sense of haughtiness, of pride. And when we talk about Shikurei Ephraim, the Radak says very simply, these are people who are completely consumed with physical pleasure. All they're concerned about is eating and drinking. They're having a good time. Now, why are they having a good time? Because they think they're on the top of the world. You only have that good kind of time when you think everything is wonderful. You don't throw parties when you see problems. You throw parties when you think things are good. And so that's the Radak's approach. V'tzitz novel tzvi tifarto. And he then says in the delight, the tzvi, we've had tzvi referring to Eretz Yisrael also as Eretz tzvi. Here we have tzvi, the delight of his glory is a fading blossom or a faded blossom. Tzitz is the blossom. Novel is beginning, like from the word nevela, where it starts to die, a withered blossom in the same sense. So what ultimately, again, the Radak says that what they're looking at is they're looking at the blossom, and they're not looking at the fact that that blossom, what they think is so very good, is already beginning to die. And they don't realize it. Asher al rosh geish manim halumei yayin, which is on top of the heads, the ateret geut, in essence, the way the Dat Mikrav reads this pasuk, he says the subject of the pasuk, the ateret geut, this crown of haughtiness, is, you keep on reading it into it. So you say, the ateret geut asher al rosh geish manim, hoy ateret asher al rosh halumei yayin. It's like you're saying this crown is everywhere. What ultimately the Geshmanim is the place where where it's a valley of a fatness. Now, the fat in the sense like the fat of the land, and in fact, the Rashi says Geshmanim is the area, the valley around Kinneret in the north. They're looking at how all the wonderful pieces, Halumei Yayin, they're going ahead and they're being battered or being hit by all the wine. They're not taking into account the realities that they're facing. So they look at it, oh, look how wonderful things are, and they're ignoring the rest, and they're feeling such self-pride and confidence that they don't realize the troubles they're in. Hine, behold, chazak ve'amitz laHashem. There's a word missing here. The word missing is, according to Rashi, Hine, it should be, Yesh Ruach Chazak Ve'amitz LaHashem. There's the spirit that's powerful, that's coming upon you from God. According to the Ibn Ezra, it's either, behold, there is going to come an army that is Chazak Ve'amitz. It's coming to be able to teach you the lesson. You're going to be conquered. Or, another possibility, the Ibn Ezra says, Hine Yom Chazak V'amitz L'Hashem. There's going to be this day of power from God. Whatever it is, we know that there's a word missing within this phrase, but it's like, behold the strength and the power of Hashem. What do you mean, behold the strength and power? Obviously, it's going to be an element of punishment that's coming towards you. Kizerem Barad, it's going to be like a current of hail. Sa'ar Katev, and it's going to be Sa'ar, the sin and the Samach are interchange. So it's a storm of that is destructive, a destructive storm. Kezerem mayim kabirim shotfim. It's going to be like this powerful water stream that's coming across, that's washing across, hiniach la'aretz biyad, and it's going to be putting down to the ground with strength. Biyad is koach in this case, according to Tzudat Zion. What do you mean is putting down? What's being put down onto the ground? Well, first of all, just for the dikduk lovers among us, the hiniach word, this hiniach is an avar bimkom atid. Okay, it's a past tense that's actually used as a future tense. If you remember, in biblical Hebrew, we do not have past, present, and future. We have perfect and imperfect. Past, present, and future very simply means, with time frames. Biblical Hebrew doesn't have time frame. Biblical Hebrew has things that have been done already, or things that are going to be done, or things that are not finished yet. So imperfect typically is future tense. Perfect, when you use a terminology of perfect, which we would call past tense, it's used in a pasuk very often to say, this is a done deal already. Even though it hasn't happened yet, it's assured to be happening. So hiniach, it's like this is gonna happen, even though it's in the future. Even though it's going to be in the future, it's done. There's no more conversation about it. Now, in this case, what is he bringing down to the ground? Ultimately, the Radak says he's taking down the haughtiness, the gavat Ephraim, that geut, the ateret geut is going to be brought down. You're going to be lowered. You're going to be, your haughtiness is going to fall. Beraglaim teramasna, with feet you will be trampled. Ateret geut shikurei Ephraim. You who are the crown of haughtiness, the drunkenness of Ephraim. Ultimately, that as the Dat Sofrim, Rabinowitz points out, he says, there are two different kinds of wars, and we see this now especially. There is a war that follows the rules of war. There's a certain, the way he writes it, it's mitnahalot b'tzura mechubedet. There's order to it. There's rules of engagement, and then there are wars that break all the rules, and they're just meant to demean and destroy the enemy. Okay, they don't follow any of the rules. Here he says, "Beraglayim teramasna." This is that second kind of war. It's not the kind of war where armies take prisoners, where armies have, there's a white flag and a white flag works and this works and you know who the civilians and who the army is. No, the war that is going to hit the north is going to be a totally destructive war beyond what would normally be the kind of reason you would expect. Va'ita tzitzat novel tzvi, and now we're going back to the beginning. Remember that first pasuk talked about the Ateret Geut Shikurei Ephraim, talked about the crowning, then it talked about the Tzitz Novel. So here, the Tzitz Novel will become Asher al Rosh Geshmanim Kibikura B'terem Kayitz. It will be like an early, what's called ripening fruit in the summer. What's an early ripening fruit? First of all, bikura comes from the word bechor. It's the first, right? It's something that's going to ripen very quickly. And what happens with something that ripens very quickly? Asher yireh haro'eh otam, that when the person sees it, ba'odah b'chapo yivla'ena, while it's still in his hand, he's going to swallow it. In other words, normally during a time of harvest, and I actually experienced it a little bit in Israel, during a time when you're harvesting stuff, you go ahead and you pick something off the tree. And if it looks like the absolute perfect fruit, you don't want to put it in the basket. You're going to eat it. Now, from the perspective of harvesting, that's fine. But from the perspective of destruction, what the Navi is saying, that you are going to be such an enemy, the enemies are going to look at you, and you're going to be immediately victimized on this. Or as Rashi says, Shemeher ma'od yavo kitzam, that right away your destruction is going to come. They're not going to wait. They're not going to put you b'shevi in captivity. Right away, they're going to be doing destruction, just like that perfect fruit. They're going to pluck right away and eat as well. That was what happens to Ephraim. So if you look at it, there's this beautiful chiastic structure. The beginning, the beginning and the end kind of match up really nicely. You have the Geut Shikure Ephraim, the Tzitzat Novel, Tifarto, you have Al Rosh Shmanim, you have what was all the things they were proud of at the end, all of those things are going to be destroyed. Just that beautiful piece of literary.
It occurred to me that what you're really saying is that in a war, you will come in and things get destroyed. So that's the vocabulary. But in the case where arrogance is the enemy that needs to be defeated, then the defeat is not the destruction, but the humiliation.
It's interesting. It's
that
would be right.
That's what you were saying, which was they're not going to just be defeated according to the rules of war, and then okay, this one is the victor and that one's not. But it's
and that could
humiliation is what's
and that fits perfectly because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying to teach a lesson, and so the way he teaches the lesson for Ga'ava is the humiliation. Yeah. We now get into a nicer piece for a little bit of a break. Okay, there's a few minutes of a break by Yomahu on that day. Now, whenever you have by Yomahu, obviously it's providing context. So by Yomahu on that day, Yeshem Tzvakot La Tzvi. Who is going to be the tzvi? Who's going to be the crown? It's HaKadosh Baruch who's going to be the crown. In other words, what's ultimately going to be happening in contradistinction to what had been before, the people who were being attacked because they were creating their own selves as the crowning glory, HaKadosh Baruch who's going to be. Ulitzvirat tifara. Tzvira is a little bit of a different kind of crown, but it's parallelism, and as well, it's going to be a glorious crown, lish'aramo. To those people, sha'aramo literally means the she'ritamo, the people who survive.
Sorry about it, but if Klal Yisrael is going to be humiliated in the north, then Hashem is humiliated.
So if, however, and this is, I hear what you say, but the reality is, and this probably is part of the reason the Radak says what he says. The Radak says this is addressing the southern kingdom. Okay, if you have a southern kingdom that is going to survive and hopefully thrive, then you can say, okay, it's not God against the Jews, it's God against the sinners. Okay. And that would humiliate God. It's the same, we have that same concept. Obviously, Moshe Rabbeinu makes that pitch a number of times of what will the nations of the world say? But here, the nations of the world will say, the Jewish people had God. This part got exiled. They must have done something wrong. This part is able to thrive. And think about the time period of Chizkiyahu HaMelech, who ultimately is going to survive that attack of Sancheriv in a miraculous fashion. And the Jewish people will thrive during his malchut, during the monarchy. So it seems to be that it can still work in that way. So, uleruach mishpat, liyoshev ala mishpat. Really, the easiest way of explaining it, it's you flip the words because it's poetic. To those who sit in judgment, they'll have the spirit of judgment. They'll know how to judge. Now, there's a machloket between the Ibn Ezra and the Radak. Who's this referring to? The Ibn Ezra says this is the Sanhedrin. That the Sanhedrin that's going to be sitting in judgment of the people, God is going to strengthen them. That's the Ibn Ezra. The Radak says, no, that this is actually going back to who's the Yoshev b'Mishpat, is the king. The Chizkiyahu HaMelech is going to be strengthened or will be graced, actually, the way he uses the terminology, Hashem Yechonen De'ah. He is going to be graced with the ability to give true justice. V'ligvura mishivei milchama sha'ara. And he's going to give gvura, Rashi says, to those who are Meshiv Milchama. Now, Rashi takes this in a poetic fashion. The Meshiv Milchama, according to Rashi, are those who are Lomdei Torah. Okay, now, if you look at it for a minute, why would Rashi say that this is referring to people who study Torah and not to those people who are coming back for more? Well, look at the totality of the pasuk. If the beginning of the pasuk talks about mishpat, talks about justice, why would the second half of the pasuk talk about war? Why would it mean literally war? How does Art Scroll translate the verse 6? How does he read it in English?
A source of strength for those who return from war to the gate.
To the gate. Okay, so he takes it literally. So, which is interesting because normally Art Scroll follows specifically with Rashi's explanation. But Rashi says this is all on the spiritual level, justice and Torah. However, okay, that the Radak says it in more of a pshat perspective, and the Radak says no, one piece is justice and one piece is war. He's going to give strength to the people who are going all the way to the gates of the enemy to be able to return alive. That's the Kfura. Those are the two pieces he's going to have. That's the hopeful piece. Right? That's the promise that's being given to the South, and it's a pretty good promise. Things are going to go well. You're going to accept God. You're going to have justice, and you're going to have Torah, and you're going to have not just justice. You'll also have that sense of security. The army will be able to return safely. Now we go though to the Southern Kingdom, to the people who aren't behaving properly. And
Just by the way, this sounds very, very relevant to today.
I agree with you fully. I agree with you fully, and it's good. And there is no question in my mind that you can easily apply all of these psukim to today, both in terms of the type of enemy and in terms of the type of leadership and in terms of the shikurei Ephraim, which unfortunately we have some of those as well. Not necessarily that they live in the north. Okay, all of these things can fit right in. Thank you, Ilana. It's good to have you back. To go back now, the third part of this parak, unfortunately, turns now to the south, which is really Yeshayahu's job. Yeshayahu's job was not to chastise the north. His job is to chastise the south and bring them along to the right way. And unfortunately, he goes, Vigam ele beyayin shagu. He says, unfortunately, as much as I cursed out the north and I gave hope for the south, there are also those who have erred because of wine, uveshechar ta'u, and also because of wine they have strayed. Shechar in biblical Hebrew is wine, is not beer. Rabbinic Hebrew uses it as beer. So, and the difference, by the way, between shagu and tau, shagu is to err, tau is to stray, to go the wrong ele. In other words, the Malbim says it explicitly, says, these people, however, there are also those who did not learn from what happened to Ephraim. Who are they? Kohen v'Nagvim. They're the Kohanim and the Nevi'im. Now, the problem on Kohanim and Levim is what I mentioned before. We don't, historically, it's a little complicated to find this. However, what the Dat Mikra gives a very nice piece on it. Dat Mikra points out, what are the two issues we're dealing with? And we'll see it in just a moment, that the Kohen has the responsibility of justice, the Navi has the responsibility of teaching, and both of them did not do the jobs they were supposed to be doing. And as I mentioned before, Targum Yonatan solves the problem with Navi by saying it's a sofer. Okay, that this is one of the scribes, a teacher, not a prophet in the same way. Shagu b'shechar, nivlu'u min hayayin, tau min hashechar, shagu b'ro'eh, paku p'liliyah. And so what did they do? They erred because of the wine. They were swallowed up from the wine. They were off because of the wine. Shagu b'ro'eh, in what they saw, they were mistaken. That's the Navi. The person who's the prophet is supposed to have a clear understanding of vision that he receives. Paku pliliyah, and paku pliliyah means he perverted. Pliliyah is justice. We know palol, pe lamed lamed is to judge. That's why the word lehit palel, to self-judge, is to daven. Okay, they perverted all of those things. The Kohen who is responsible to take care of justice, Yom Mishpatecha liYakov v'Toratecha liYisrael, that's the job of the Kohen. They blew it. The job of the Navi is to see clearly what is happening. He blew it. Ki kol shulchanot malu ki tzo'ah bli makom. All of their tables were filled with vomit. There was nothing left. Now, this is not a really pleasant vision to talk about, but if you're talking about drunkards, it plays into that imagery as well. Interestingly, and this comes back from the Dat Sofrim, if you go to Pirkei Avot, Perek Gimel Gimel, this pasuk is actually quoted, and it's quoted for a halacha, that if Shlosha she'achlu al shulchan echad. If three people are eating together at a table, v'lo amru divrei Torah, and they don't say divrei Torah among themselves, ki'ilu achlu mizivchei meitim. It's like they ate from the offerings to the dead, like from like offerings of avodah zarah. So interestingly, it's this is a very, very a very, very different way of looking at it. We're saying that quoting this pasuk means a lack of Torah, according to Pirkei Avot. And according to Pirkei Avot, that's really it. According to Pirkei Avot, what they were missing, ki kol shulchanot malu ki tzoah b'li makom, is talking about the Torah was absent from their lives. And you can prove that from the Pirkei Avot. That obviously is not the pshat. The pshat here is a prophetic vision that's talking about drunkards. Now, we know it's drunk with power in many ways, or drunk with physical pleasure. And therefore, we continue that same kind of shocking statement about of an image. That works. But Pirkei Avot takes it a different step and says that once again, it's referring to the lack of Torah, which if you remember, and we go back to Pasuk Vav, where he talked about V'ligvura meshivei milchama shara, also the Medrash had said is talking about the lack of Torah. Now comes a piece which there's a machloket of exactly what's happening. So according to the Abarbanel, what the Navi is going to say now, he's bemoaning the current state of affairs. According to the Dat Mikra, and I didn't find a classic source of it, but I'm sure there's probably one as well. According to the Dat Mikra, here, the people who have rebelled, who are the drunkards, are making fun of the Navi. So there's two different perspectives. I'll present it in each part of these psukim themselves. Et mi yoredean, says the Navi, who can I teach? Vet mi yavin shmua, who's going to understand? The only ones left are going to be the little children, okay, the ones who have just been weaned. Are those the only ones? Rashi takes this approach as well. The only ones are going to listen to me. The Navi says, are these? According to the Dat Mikra, what's happening here? The people who are so full of themselves are saying to the Navi, who do you think you're talking to? Who do you think you're trying to teach? You think you're trying to teach a bunch of little children? We're smarter than you. We know better than you. Kitzav letzav, tzav letzav, kav lekav, kav lekav, zeir sham, zeir sham. We know this from the 2 weeks ago or 2 Shabbosim ago. This was the Haftarah. We know these words, and the tzav letzav means, and according very simply, tzav letzav, tzav letzav, the Ibn Ezra says, it's like you teach a little bit at a time. Just a little bit of a rule here, a little bit of a rule there, one line here, one line there, a tiny zeir sham, a little bit, teach it a little bit at a time. And that's what the Navi has been mourning. He says, all I got left to talk to are the little kids. All the adults, they perverted everything. I can only look at them, and then I can only teach a little bit at a time. According to the Dat Mikra, okay, what the people are saying is, what you're teaching us is childish. You're teaching us about these little things. It's like you're pulling out a sefer to teach us instead of teaching us with Chumash. How can you do such a thing? We are better. We know more than you know in this. Ki b'la'agei safa u'v'lashon acheret yedaber el ha'am hazeh. Because, or since, with an unintelligible language, b'la'agei safa. Rashi says that ultimately, if a person doesn't want to listen to how you're trying to direct them, it's like you're just talking nonsense to them. And that's the way he explains it. Ki, according to Rashi, is like or as. The Dat Mikra actually says, no, this ki means therefore. Therefore, because you are making fun, you're mocking the Navi, you're refusing to listen to the Navi, therefore what's going to happen is ultimately you're going to be subject to bila'agei safa, to unintelligible languages, ulashon acheret, foreign languages, Yedaber Olam Hazeh, you're going to be conquered by a foreign power that's not going to speak to you in a language you understand. They're going to talk to you in other languages. Asher Amar Alehem. And in this case, the Navi is saying, listen, I told you, Zotam Nucha. This should be your source of rest. Heinichu Layev, the place where the tired should go, Vizot Hamargea. And this should be the Margea. Margea could either be satisfaction or Menucha once again. Velo Avu Shmo. They didn't want to hear. According to the Ibn Ezra, what's Zot? This? He's saying Yerushalayim. Don't go anywhere else. Remember, Rashi's approach on all of this is that the Navi is saying, I can't talk to them anymore. They're not listening to me. The only ones I can talk to are the little ones. They're not listening. That whatever I say, they don't seem to understand. And what I told them was, don't go to other places. Zot, Yerushalayim should be the place where you're searching. The Radak says, no, I told them all the good things that could happen. Okay, the Torah mitzvot, the things they should be doing, and they're not listening to me. And as a result, lo avu shmoa, they didn't want to hear me. They didn't want to pay attention to me. Vayalahem dvar Hashem, tzav l'tzav, tzav l'tzav, kav l'kav, kav l'kav, zir sham, zir sham. And for them, what God was saying seemed like nonsense. They didn't pay any attention to him. Okay, and therefore what's going to happen? They're going to be punished, midah keneged midah, measure for measure in what they did, since they ignored all of the opportunities they had. Ultimately, they're going to stumble. Now, kashlu, stumbling, is again going back to that image of a drunkard. A drunkard trips. Okay, they're going to do that. Then v'kashlu achor v'nishbaru, they're going to fall backwards. Now, falling backwards is the worst kind of falling. You can't protect yourself. They're going to have that. V'nishbaru, they'll be broken. V'nokshu, and they're going to trip. V'nilkadu, and they're going to be entrapped. That ultimately they won't be able to save themselves because either they made fun of the Navi or they were unwilling to listen to the Navi. In both cases, these are people, this is a nation who thought they were better. These are the leaders of the nation, the Kohen and the Navi. Comes Pasuk Yudalid, next piece. And this now talks about, this next piece, talks about the fact that they were feeling very good about themselves because they had made this treaty with Mitzrayim, that they had searched out other people to help them, other nations to be supportive of them, and it's not going to work. L'chein, shim'u dvar Hashem anshe latzon. And therefore, listen to the word of God, the people who are, according to the classic Meforshim, people who are leitzim, the people who scoff at, the people who make fun at, the mockers. Listen, according to the Ibn Ezra, he adds even more. He says those people who say that all this is childish, it's a tzav l'tzav kind of situation. Dat Mikra takes it differently, and he actually is pretty strong about this. He says that ultimately the Anshe Lashon, if you look at the next phrase, the parallel phrase, Moshlei Ha'am Hazeh, the people who create, Moshlei Ha'am says this is talking about not the people who are the rulers, but the people who create Mishalim, who create parables, who try to teach through parables. And therefore he says, Letz is from the word, Letzim is from the word Militza, meaning people who talk about with this beautiful language, the poetic kind of language. He's talking, both of them ultimately take the approach, he's talking about people who are trying to guide the nation. Either it's Moshlim or those who are making Mishalim, who make the parables. But that Mikra is pretty confident that Latzon should be Militza and not Leitzim. He says, Asher b'Yerushalayim. They're in Yerushalayim. Ki amartem. Now you said, all of this is talking about the covenants you had between Yisrael and Mitzrayim, simplest way of saying it. However, that Julius Hirsch adds into it. He says, in the name of his father, you thought to yourselves that you're like everybody else. And therefore, you have a danger. Let's make a treaty. Let's try to get alliances happening. Hitchalnu litnaheg kamo sharamim, says Hirsch, okay? Ki amartem karatnu vrit et mavet. We have entered into a covenant with death. What does a covenant with death mean? A covenant with death in this case means we've made deals, the way we would say you made a deal with the devil. The same kind of concept. We've entered into a contract with the depths. Again, all that same piece. Shot, shotef, ki avor lo yevoenu. And we did all of this to make sure that the staff which comes quickly and hits, will not pass, will not reach us. Ki samnu chazav machsenu uvesheker nistarnu. He says, because we have brought about deceit as our shelter, and with lies we have hidden. In other words, we've come up with these plans. Now the Navi is making fun of them. They say, hey, we have all of these alliances, we have all of these assurances, we have all these protections in place. And when the Navi is saying all your protections are false, everything you think you're going to be going is not true. You've made that, made the deal with the devil itself. You've entered into with an enemy. It's not true that my enemy's enemy is my friend. My enemy's enemy, okay, is also an enemy, okay? And maybe temporarily you can help, but not long-term. Lachein. Ko amar Hashem tzvakot. Therefore, says Hashem and Hashem tzvakot, the God of hosts, because this is the power. Hineni yisad b'tzion aven. He said, behold, I have created in Zion a rock, even bochan, one that has been tested. In other words, a powerful rock. Pinat yikrat. It is the cornerstone. It's Pinat Yikrat is actually literally at the corner of the stone. Okay, the cornerstone. Musad. Now, Musad could be, in this case, by the way, it could be very simply very, very secure, or it could be Musad, which is a noun, which has been Musad, which has been placed in power. In other words, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying is, I have created for you the way you're going to protect yourself. According to Rashi, this is a description of the Melech HaMashiach. You shouldn't have done what you were planning on doing. I had put forth a plan which would have saved you instead of you going to Mitzrayim. Hama'amin lo yachish. Ultimately, if you had believed, says Mitzudat Sion, you wouldn't be rushing into it. Don't rush into these other alliances. Have faith in me. Have faith in me. The Barbanel, interestingly, says, Lo yachish should not be, don't be quiet about it. Realize that you have that protection. V'samti mishpat lakav. And I have placed an opportunity for justice, lakav, to be measured, to be on a line, Utzdaka mishkalet, and also it's going to be an tzedakah, and the righteousness is going to be weighed. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, listen, this is Rashi's approach to it. He says, there are going to be problems. You're going to be punished. Ultimately, before the Mashiach comes, there will be decrees against the people. And there's going to be an element of yisurin, of suffering that's going to happen. However, there's also going to be tzedakah, that ultimately the people who are the tzaddikim will survive. V'ya'am, varad machsei chazav, and then but what will happen is the hail. We talked about a hail earlier. We talked about it in the way it was going to sweep out the north. Well, that same kind of hail is going to come. It's going to sweep the machseis chazav, your false places of hiding, the seter mayim yishtofu, and the secret places, water is going to sweep them all away. In other words, as Rashi says, in contradistinction to what you had thought about before, what you thought the reason you were so safe, you're not safe. All of that is going to be taken away from you. This goes back to Pasuk Tedvav itself. God promises there's going to be the punishment. Okay, and in fact, Says the Radak, all of this is actually reminding us of Sancheriv's army. If you remember from Melachim Bet, when Sancheriv comes against the north, he sweeps across the north, and then he attacks the south. He conquers most of the south. He comes to Yerushalayim and places it under siege, and only through a miracle HaKadosh Baruch Hu saves Yerushalayim. So this is, according to the Radak, a description of the way Sancheriv is going to sweep through Eretz Yisrael and destroy so much of Eretz Yisrael itself. But ultimately, there's going to be that salvation. The chupar britchem et mavet, and what's going to happen? The covenants, the treaties you've entered into with death are going to be taken away, are going to be nullified. V'chazutchem et she'ol lo takum, and all of the contracts you had with the depths, with the enemy will not happen. Shot shotev ki yavor. Actually, exactly what you were afraid of that quickly coming rod that's going to beat, that's gonna come because of you. Vayitem lo lemirmas, and you're going to be trampled upon. Remember, we had that ultimate termasna before, and now we see what had happened to the north. Elements of it are going to happen to the south as well. L'chein, and therefore, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Skipped a bit. I'm sorry. Yeah. Midei ovro yikach etchem. Whenever midei ovro yikach etchem. What ultimately is going to happen? They're going to go. And they're going to do whenever they want. They're going to destroy portions of the land. Kiva boker, baboker, yavor, bayomu, valayla. They're going to come in every morning. They're going to come night and day. Vayarak zav'a havin shmua. And the only one who is going to be frightened by it, who's going to experience the horror, is the one who really understands the Shmuah was being told. Rav Schwab pointed out on this, that the only ones who really will understand what's going on are the people who've listened to the Navi. And you could, again, think about all sorts of modern comparisons to this. When you see all sorts of things happening around you, and all of a sudden, you poo-poo them. You don't realize what's really happening. But when the Navi tells you that this is what's going to happen, and then you look at everything, you realize what's happening. And so the Navi says, those who pay attention will get it. Those who don't pay attention are not going to get it. And he gives a fascinating mashal. And again, if I take the Dat Mikras approach, that this is against the Moshlim, the people who were the educators who tried to teach the people via parables, it makes sense that at the end of his piece of Nevuah, he gives a quick mashal as well. It's not the final two, but he gives one of them. And he says, Ki katzar hamatzah mihishtareh. He says the pillow or the couch is too short to be able to stretch it. Imagine for yourself, you're lying down on a short couch and it just doesn't fit you. And you just can't make it any bigger. On the one hand, v'masechat sarah meitkanes, and the blanket is too short to cover you. In other words, all form of your protection, which you thought was going to happen, all of that is not going to be available to you. As the Radak says, ultimately, Ashur is going to come. They're going to offer you protection by taxation. No matter what you do, you're not going to be able to pay for that taxation. You're going to try to stretch here and there. It's not going to work. And as a result, you're going to be conquered. If you take the Mitzudat Zion, he just points out, Kihit kanes, just like the word Nidchei Yisrael Yikanes means to gather. You're not going to be able to curl yourself up and be able to fit onto that couch itself. Ki chahar pratzim yakum Hashem. Because God at this point is going to rise up like Har Pratzim. Har Pratzim we actually find is a place. It's where in Divrei Yamim Aleph, Yudalid, in the beginning of that parak, we talk about a war that David HaMelech had against the Plishtim. Okay, God is going to rise up like David HaMelech conquered the Plishtim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to rise up against the Rishaim among us. Ke'emek begivon yirgaz, he's going to be angered just like Emek Givon, this is the famous battle in Yehoshua of Shemesh Begivon Dom, just like where miraculous things happen. Rav Hirsch says, if you look at these two, what it says, God is going to rise up in both natural and supernatural ways. Just like the battle of David HaMelech took place in what we would call natural war, and just like the battle with Yehoshua took place with supernatural ways, God will attack the Rishaim in both ways. Interestingly, the Targum Yonatan, which is quoted by Rashi, says the Har Paratzim is not the Har Paratzim in David HaMelech, but rather it's referring to a different piece, a earthquake which took place in the time of Uziyahu HaMelech that's mentioned in Zechariah, Perek Yudalid, which is the Perek that's all talking about the Geulah. But whichever way we take it, it is God is going to come with power. The beauty of taking the approach of the Radak on both of these is then you have that piece of Rav Hirsch of the two different ways. Why is God mentioning two? Is it just parallelism, which would be Rashi's position? Both are natural, powerful battles that took place, natural things that occurred, or is it going to talk about supernatural and natural itself? La'asot ma'asehu zar ma'asehu. God is going to do things, okay, that is going to make him seem like a stranger to you. Now, if God is making himself being a stranger, that means he's not protecting you. Bad will come. And God is going to cause you to do, he's going to do his work like that is strange, and nochri, that same kind of concept. And now, al tit lotzatsu. Don't, again, that Mikra says to the people who are in charge, who normally speak with this beautiful language, don't give any more of your poetry. You're done. Okay, you got to tell it straight. According to Rashi and the other classic Meforshim, they say, stop mocking. Pen yechziku mosrechem, lest your punishment, your what's going to be binding you will be stronger, ki chala v'necharatza, because it is total and it is fit and it's finished. Shamati me'et Hashem Elokim tzvakot al kol haaretz. I have heard this, says the Navi. Don't stop leading them astray. Powerful words. And now we end with the two Mishalim.
These are the leaders.
What?
These are the leaders.
The leaders, he's right. Hazinu v'shimu koli. Now, hazinu, right away you hear this is poetry. Okay. Hazinu v'shimu koli. Listen to my voice. Hakshivu v'shimu imrati. Listen to what I'm going to say. Hakol hayom yacharosh hachoresh lizroa. Does someone who plows, does he plow constantly? Okay. Does he never stop? He just keeps on plowing? Yifatach v'yishader admato. Okay. Does he just go ahead and open up? The difference between yifatach? Yifatach is the kind of plowing that takes place before rain. You want to have the water get into the ground. Yishaded admato is talking about where you're trying to level out the ground. Haloim shiva fana. Isn't it if when the surface has been leveled, in other words, when you're done, then what happens is they feeds ketzach. First thing he does is he spreads the ketzach. Ketzach is black cumin. Okay. Then v'chamon yizrok. And then he throws out the plain cumins. And these are talking about the seeds, obviously. Then v'sam chita. And he puts the wheat. This is following the approach that the chitam was actually planted very carefully. Shora, usora nisman. It's a question of whether or not Sorah actually applies to the chita, kama, Sorah, which seems to be another one of the kinds of the Chameshet Minim. Usoram barley nisman, and it's as you were designated, the chusemet gvulato, and then he puts the chusemet along the boundaries. Rashi says what this is describing is not only the way they plant, but where they plant. That they plant on the outer edges. Ultimately, the chusemet, the chita is towards the middle, and each one of the steps. The Yisrael Mishpat, and then rebuked for justice, teaching him for justice, Elokav Yorenu, and God teaches him. The Ibn Ezra says the way they plant is something they learned from God. It's something they've learned over the years how to plant things. Don't they know that? Okay. Then kilova charutz, yet yudash ketzah, because we know that when you go ahead and you thresh, you have specific ways to thresh different produce. When it comes to the question of this black cumin, you don't use the heavy threshing boards. You don't do that. The ofan agalal kamon yusav, and you don't go ahead and use the wheel that would trample over the cumin. Keep it mateh yechavet ketzach v'chamon v'shavet. The way you thresh them is you beat them. It's a different way to thresh. Why? Well, just from the agricultural perspective, the seeds are soft. Because the seeds are soft, if you try to thresh them in the regular ways, you'll destroy the seeds. There's ways to do things for different pieces. This is all still part of the mashal. We're not teaching agriculture. Lechem yudak. And when it comes to the wheat for bread, there it's going to be made small. It's going to be crushed. You don't keep on threshing it forever. You don't go over and over and over it. And also when you break, okay, the wheel of the and you don't break it with the wheel of your agala, of your wagon, or farasavlo yedukeno, and you don't go ahead and put it over the riders to go ahead and crush it. Gamzo Hashem tzvakot yatzah. This also comes from God. He flietsam. God's plan is not able to be understood, unfathomable probably. He deal to Shia, and his wisdom is great. Now, what's the mashal all about? The mashal, according to Rashi's approach, which is probably the simplest pshat approach, Rashi's approach says what this mashal is saying, look, I've talked to you just now about potential destruction. I've talked to you about all the things the enemies will do against you. The reality is, God has a plan, and he will smite and he will punish, measured it depending on who the person, what the nation are. He knows who he's dealing with. He's not dealing with this kind of produce or that kind of produce. He knows what kind of produce he's dealing with, the Jewish people he's dealing with. And unfortunately, he's going to met out the justice as necessary. And at the very same time, it won't be too much. You'll be able to survive. And that's the mashal, according to Rashi, the way the Navi ends off this piece. Next week, we'll be back all together. It'll be the same time this year. We'll hit Perek Chavtet. And have a wonderful day, everyone.